There's lots of people telling you exactly what to do to find a property and to get a mortgage, but no one is really talking about what you should do when you actually get the keys. So in today's video, we'll be talking to you about all the things that you should be doing as soon as you get the keys to your new home. Hello, welcome back to our channel and podcast. My name is Gemma, and here at WS we talk about all things related to money, mortgages and positive money mindset. So if that interests you, then be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the thumbs up. It really helps with our YouTube algorithm and means that you won't miss out on any of our videos. On today's episode of Let's Talk Money and Mortgages, we have Iftikhar joining us once again. Ifti is a trained accountant and mortgage advisor who has been in the industry for over 10 years, and he's also one of the founding directors here at WIS. Iftikhar, nice to have you back on the show again.
Hi, lovely to be back, Gemma. Thank you.
So we've had a lot of people recently kind of moving into their properties and then sort of saying to us, well, now what? What do I do now? Because no one really talks about it, do they?
True. Yeah, true. Especially with the first-time buyers, they're a little clueless when it comes to this, so yeah.
Okay, if we're starting kind of at the beginning, when you get the keys, what would be your first tips for people that have just moved in somewhere?
I think before somebody moves into the property, usually there's a stage where it's called exchange, right? Where you agree that you're definitely buying the property. That usually happens just few days before you complete. When you complete is when you actually get the keys. So at the point of exchange, I strongly suggest that people on that day or just before that go into the property and see what's the condition of the property, because you may have seen the property say 2 months before when you made the offer, and you may have never been to the house since, right? So go at the point of exchange to see whether anything has changed, right? Because I've had a situation where one of my clients went to a property and then realized that the back wall had been knocked over by a container. So he didn't have a back wall, right? So he just wanted to know how things were going to be resolved. So he spoke to the seller about it, right? So that's just before exchange he did this, right? So that kind of delayed the exchange a little bit because he wanted that resolved before he moved into the property. Because obviously the insurance was paying for it, but his insurance wouldn't cover it, whereas the other guy was moving out, right? So it's going to be quite messy. So he wanted those sorted before anything else. So the best thing is just go into the property just before exchange, make sure that everything is in order, and then that's when you come back, right? And when you get the keys, check whether everything is still in order. Because I've had a situation where one of my clients bought a property and there's a nice picture on the wall, it looked very nice, but when he went to the house, as soon as he got the keys, there's a hole in the wall, right? So you just need to make sure that there's no problems, so that if there is anything, you should be able to resolve that before, right? So therefore it's always a good idea to go around, see whether there's any damages which were not originally there, because you probably want to highlight that to the seller as soon as possible and get any remedial action arranged before you sort of actually really settle down, right? So I think that'll be the best thing that you can do as soon as you get the keys. Yeah.
Thanks, Ifti. And also, just like in terms of what questions that you should be asking the seller, like when you move in, for instance, like who is the gas, water and electric provider, things like that.
That's right. So you have to be a little careful with that, because what happens is, last minute everybody is in a rush because seller is likely to sell it and buy another property. So they'll have their own problems. So therefore, these are questions you probably want to ask in advance, right? Because otherwise you'll end up going into the property, you won't know who the electricity supply is, who the gas supply is, who does the water, because unlike before, water supplies can vary as well from place to place, right? So you have to sort of know who these suppliers are so that you can quickly get in touch with them and tell them, look, these things are now with us. We have to give you new names and addresses and things like that, and make sure that the records are updated. And it's very, very important that you take the meter readings, right? As soon as you go to the house, if possible, just take a picture from your phone, because that is a proof by itself, because usually phone has the time and the date and all that sort of things. In case there's a dispute, you can always bring it up with the provider, because sometimes the seller might have taken the meter readings 2 days before they left the house. But who knows, the lights may have been up throughout the night because they're packing up to move, sort of thing, right? You might end up with a high bill for the last 2 days, so you don't want all those complications. So make sure you take those pictures and you can store it in your phone and make sure those are read out. So those are probably the first things you want to do when you move into the house. Yeah.
Okay. And what about, switching off the water or switching it back on? Like, how do you even know where the switch is?
That's one that gets a lot of people, right? Quite often what happens, people are in a rush when they move to the house. They just get everything sorted, put the boxes where it belongs, unpack, make sure that, they're excited about the new house as well. So they forget about this, right? I've had horror stories I've heard because in the middle of the night, there's a leak and they don't know how to stop the tap, right? So the tap can be anywhere, right? Most of the time it's under the sink, right? But I've found situations where people have told me, okay, it's in the airing cupboard, and some said it's up in the loft, right? And some said it's outside the house. Just imagine you have a leak, right? And you don't know where your tap is, right? And it's in the middle of the road.
You're hunting around.
Oh yeah, that's definitely not something you want. So just make sure you know your tap where it is, right? Because in an emergency, you can stop it, right? So yeah.
And what about, Ifti, when you move in, keys and things? Like, what about keys for the windows, keys for the doors? Like, do you need to get a list, or what happens with that?
Yeah, I mean, usually the previous owners will leave that for you, right? Just make sure you take all the copies, because in the rush, they might take their old keys and go, right? Because obviously for your safety, you probably want to do this. Just make sure that all the keys are there. Just try all the windows. Usually the windows keys are, for the house, it's universal, right? So it should be okay. But just make sure that you have enough, because otherwise you don't want to be swapping keys between windows, right? So it's quite messy. Just make sure that you have those. And just make sure you have keys for each and every door. Obviously, it's always a good idea to have duplicates as well, because sometimes they don't have duplicates, right? So just make sure that you have a spare set. But just make sure that the previous seller doesn't have a copy as well, because, quite often in the rush, they forget to give their copy and they just give the estate agent's copy to you, and, that's all you end up with, right? So just make sure you take all that. And just make sure you have spares, right? Because some locks can be a little funny, because nowadays locks are quite complicated, right? So if you lock yourself out, without a spare, it's quite messy. So just make sure you have some spares as well for yourself, Yeah.
And what would you say about, changing the locks? Is that something that most people do when they move into a new home?
I think it is a good practice, right? Just to avoid anything. I mean, I'm not saying the seller is bad, but sometimes sellers give spare keys to somebody to maybe clean the house while tradesmen, they may have copies, right? I know that sometimes people buy houses which have not been occupied for a while. Now, those ones, there's always tradesmen who come in, the gardeners might come in, the cleaners might come in. They may have spare sets of keys, right? So you don't want to have those risks. Changing locks aren't very expensive. A lot of people do it themselves, right? So, if you go into a large sort of DIY store, you can easily buy locks and change it yourself, right? So it's something that you probably want to do, right, to avoid all these potential security issues, right? So you probably want to get those done for sure,
What about, things like documents and warranties for kitchen appliances, all that sort of stuff, right? You need to check before.
Yeah, these are stuff you probably want to do even just before you exchange. You probably want to go and speak to the seller and just make sure that books are left out, right? Because the last thing you want is, okay, you just moved into the house and you want to eat something or maybe have a cup of tea and you want to boil some water, but you can't get your kettle to work or the heating system to work or whatever it is, right? So it's probably best to go and get some instructions. Quite often, most of these equipment, which are sort of, the built-in stuff, or even if it's a standalone thing, it comes with a booklet. And quite often people do have these booklets because that's where they go to when there's a problem, right? So just make sure those are there. The last thing you want is moving to the house. Let's say you're in winter and your heating system doesn't work, right? It doesn't work because you don't know which buttons to press. To be honest, this happened to me when I bought my first house, right? So I'm just telling you, nobody was there to tell me this, right? I know, yeah. So, yeah, I know. And I was trying to contact the seller who's actually not even in the country, right? So it was a bit of a funny situation, right? So you don't want to be in that situation. So get these things checked up before you sort of even get the keys. But on the day, just make sure that they've left everything back so that you won't have to contact them later.
Okay. Now, we've heard a bit of some horror stories of people moving in and the previous owner taking things along with them which they never realised they were taking. Can you give us a bit more detail about that whole process?
Yeah, so you've got to be very careful, right? When you buy a property, the solicitors generally send you a list of items that the seller leaves back, right? So quite often it's a long list and a lot of people just ignore it, right? So just make sure that you go through that list before you sign the final contract and just make sure that whatever you want is left back, right? I think it's funny you asked that question because clients have told me, the previous seller took away the curtain poles and I don't have curtain poles in the house, right? But, if it's not part of the contract, you can't do anything about it because you never asked for the curtain poles, right? And likewise, chandeliers. Sometimes people put beautiful chandeliers so that the house looks nice and you can sell it. Guess what? You walk into the house, the chandelier's gone, right? But it's not their fault because they didn't say that it's part of the contract, right? So remember, first thing is when you buy the house, if you're negotiating with the chandelier, just make sure it's there and just make sure that the curtain poles are also written somewhere, right? But then just make sure that that list of items, you tick it properly and everything is in that. And when you move, just make sure that you tick it against that list as well to make sure that everything is left back, right? Because sometimes it could even be mistakes because people just take it, unknowingly. Because the mover comes in, the mover doesn't know what to do. They have to make a call. They say, oh, let's take this as well, right? So they might take it away, right? So it's always a good practice you take that list around and making sure that everything is around, yeah.
Sure. And I guess just to finalize this whole thing, are there any more fees that you should be aware of, like that happens right at the end that you might have forgotten about, or anything that could be a surprise?
Yeah, so you have to be very careful because a lot of people don't do this. I think a lot of people miss out on redirecting their addresses. Obviously, that comes with a cost, right? Just make sure you redirect your address. Don't expect the new owner of your previous house or the new tenant to send your letters, right? I mean, everybody will say, yeah, we'll do it, but it doesn't happen always, right? So make sure you redirect. So keep some cost for that, right? As a practice, I used to leave some envelopes with my address pre-stamped as well, because what happens is sometimes the postman misses, right? And it just goes, the letter still goes there. So if you have those odd letters come through, they can always post it to you. But don't rely too much on them. Please do pay the post office and get it sorted, because that's the safest thing that you can do. Because there can be security risk as well if you don't do this, right? Because quite often people go and change, okay, I'll change my bank address and I'll change, one or two addresses, but they forget to change each and every address. So these problems can come up. I've had situations where clients have got parking fines sort of thing come through the door, missed, and it just goes to the county court and they've got a county court judgment now against them sort of thing, right? So please do pay the post office. I think that's a good investment and get those things sorted. Yeah. So that's something for you to bear in mind. But also with every move, you got to plan out, because there can be stuff that's not working in the house, right? Quite often it's a new house, you have some kind of warranty or, the builders are around, you can get these things done. But if it is an older property, you might have damages which you may have to sort of look at immediately. So there may be some cost involved. So, just plan for those things as well, for sure. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Ifti, again for some great advice. I just wanted to put a reminder out there that these points may or may not be applicable to everybody. So please do check with an advisor if these are suitable to you. And if you don't have an advisor, I will leave our WRS contact details below, as we are always happy to help. A little reminder that a mortgage is secured against your home or property, so it may be repossessed if you do not keep up with the mortgage repayments. Thank you again for joining us today. We'll be back next week with another episode of Let's Talk Money and Mortgages. Have a great day, stay safe, and we'll see you again soon.